Welcome, my fellow patriots. This is TPL Media. Yes, you can find us at tplmedia.ca, or you can download the app on Android and Apple. Pretty much anywhere you can find apps, you can find TPL Media. True Patriot Love. Search for it on the App Store and the Apple Store. Today, we're talking about a subject that I don't know if I'm built enough to talk about it, but I think the way that I'm genetically been laid out, I think I can. So that just pushes that over to the side. We're going to talk about modern masculinity. And today my guest is going to be our resident psychotherapist, Sim, the Simulator Chhabra. How are you, brother?
I'm good, Brady. Nice to see you.
So before we start this show, I brought my smelling salts, because smelling salts are super manly if you watch podcasts. Have you ever tried smelling salts before?
No.
These are 10 times stronger than the ones that are supposed to be on the market. So let's start this off. I need to give myself a blast of masculinity before we go.
Suck it up, Buttercup.
Oh, all right. I am ready to talk about being a man. Sim, what do you know about being a man? Are you a man?
Ooh, that's a good question.
I want to try and keep it light because I feel like this conversation might steer into a direction where it might get a little serious by the time we get out of here. So I'd like to start light. Are you a man, and why are you a man?
So through a identity, I would say yes, I'm a man.
Yeah.
Why I'm a man? Because it is what it is, kind of thing.
Okay.
I don't know how best to answer that. Perhaps over the course of the podcast, I might be able to answer that question a bit better.
So I'm going to tell you what I'm constantly working on myself daily. I'm constantly telling myself to man up, right? And for years, we've been told that that term is a negative term now. And I don't know why. I don't know if it was a Gillette commercial during the pandemic that came out that seemed to get a lot of steam with a new evolved mentality on things that said, yes, we shouldn't be telling young men to man up. It's not a very realistic standpoint, and they're allowed to cry. And I do agree with that. I think men should be emotional, and you should show your emotions. There's no need to hide them. But I do think taking away the term man up from people and internally, now, however you want to take that phrase and make it apply to your life is a completely different conversation, but let's just try and keep it in a little bit of a box for a second. If I feel like I'm doing something that isn't, and I shouldn't say masculine, but if I feel like I'm being overly emotional about something, or I'm overanalyzing something that I don't need to, a lot of the time I can get myself out of my own head by saying, Brady, just man up.
Yeah, that's a fair statement.
Right. So when I see the Gillette commercials come out and I see that mentality kind of evolve over years, and it has since the 90s, right? Like 90s seems to be, and maybe it's just because I was coming into my own as a young man in the late 90s and early 2000s. I noticed the switch. I noticed the switch from being to walking around, and I guess for a lack of better terms, to walking around stiff, right? And keeping your head up and your chin up and taking it on the chin and taking your lumps when you get them, and you just put them in the backpack and you keep going. And I think that the mentality was, well, if you put all this stuff in a backpack, eventually that backpack's going to get heavy and it's going to wear you down and you're going to break eventually somewhere. What out of what I'm saying in the past minute and a half here, what do you think is actual truths, and what do you think are misconceptions from some of the things that I've said, if there is any?
So you brought up some very good points. In terms of the actual word man up, it's just a word. I think people do get stuck in it. People then start taking sides, because then they're like, well, what about emotional expression? And what about, if I want to feel things? Mm-hmm. You can do both. I think man up, in the sense, it's kind of like a word that we use that we understand. I'm sure the opposite gender has their particular phrase, right? That they use internally. I do have an agreement with you in the sense that it's getting where now, if you do use that word in the context that you're presenting it in, which is man up, there's an offense to it. People tend to get offended by it, and I think it's being misinterpreted. One of the points that I really kind of caught on is what you said, what happened to you in the 90s and stuff, in terms of, you just realized I got to do it. And then it just.
Well, I'll tell you what it was. I watched My Girl when I was like 12 years old, and I cried at the end of it, and I felt super uncomfortable. And the reason why I cried wasn't the same reason why I cried when I was a kid and I watched Homeward Bound. It tapped into something as a young man with my hormones going crazy, where I watched My Girl and I'm like, I don't like the fact that I cried at the end of this movie.
How old were you?
Probably 12, 13.
Okay. I got teary-eyed when Mufasa died. So
Wait,
and I still can't watch it. I
don't want to
can't
out you
watch.
on your age, but you can't be much older than I am.
I was in grade 11, so I was almost 14.
You're not too far. Yeah, you're not too far off from where I am.
We're okay. I still can't watch it. Like, when it comes to that part, I will still, as an adult, cannot watch Mufasa die.
But so let's take yourself back to grade 11, right? And when you were in that mentality, did you feel uncomfortable? Did it make you feel weird as a man?
No, it didn't. What it did is I didn't understand it.
That's what I felt. I didn't understand
I just
why.
didn't understand it. And I wouldn't say it was how it's being presented now, where what's wrong with me? I just didn't understand it. Right? And teenage boys, we go through this massive transformation of testosterone growth in our early teen years. So we go through that mixed bag of emotions that gets mirrored by women in menopause.
Okay.
So what we that confusion and the yin yang and all of that we feel in our early teens is what they feel on that end, where, all of a sudden, I don't know how your early teens were, but it's like you're going through growth spurts and
Well, I was a child actor that was busy at the same time too. So my childhood is probably far off the norm of most of the average kids.
Yeah,
so I think I went through a whirlwind of bullshit.
Right.
That a lot of people don't go through. It was good, but with the good comes the bad, right? So
right. And
I was very confused.
Right. But if you go back into the 90s, right? And I think earlier in the podcast you were talking about what were you mentioning about a role model that you were using as an imagery? Just remind me again.
Well, okay, so it could have been before we were talking too, because we had a pretty long discussion before. But with role models, so actually, you know what? To not even go back to the point that I was talking about, role models is a good place for us to actually start at the beginning of this real conversation.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that you kind of steered it there, and we're not going to steer back to what I originally said, because role models has to be a talking point here and a lead into a bigger conversation. We have role models for men, obviously, right? That have been put on a platform over the past, let's say, we'll just take the past 10 years. I think it started with Jordan Peterson. His initial introduction to the world online outside of the university scene was he made rules for young gentlemen to get their lives straight, ones that seemed to be falling off, right? Or without structure. He gave them structure. And I think that started a movement. Now, Jordan has gone a completely different direction in 10 years, but the beginning of that movement started there. Then you see things like the extremes, like the Andrew Tates eventually show up, right? So COVID, people were talking about Andrew Tate. A couple years after COVID, they're still talking about Andrew Tate.
Yeah.
Now he's become a meme because he lost a boxing match after talking about being a tough guy. But the journey to get to that point was based off of masculinity.
Yeah.
And based off of alpha male syndrome and just looking at your life as being a man and trying to embrace that primal sense of manliness.
Yeah.
And some of the things that he says are completely disgusting. Then there's some other things that he says in interviews where you're like, I kind of get it.
Yeah. See,
but if it was said from somebody else, it would probably resonate a little bit more with other people than it would with a guy like Andrew Tate, who seems to be from the extremes, right? But
so if we put Andrew Tate on one side, one of the podcasts that I did with one of our other hosts, Shaliza, and it was on why Tom Brady can't date. So, you could have Andrew Tate on one side where anything that comes out of his mouth is controversial and hated.
It's crazy.
And then you go to the other end of the spectrum and you put Tom Brady. And the reason why I'm putting them on that spectrum is because we're having a conversation about masculinity. We're not having a conversation on the individual.
But they're two polar opposites in the world of masculinity.
Right. But we as average Joes, we're looking at two men that are presenting a certain way to personify emotions, right? Andrew Tate went through kickboxing, so his masculinity comes through overt aggression, and then you look at Tom Brady as a quarterback, right? When he got tackled, you had to get up and finish the play. You twisted your ankle, you had to get up and finish the play. You had to finish the game. It was raining, it didn't matter. You finished the game, right? So it's that same mentality that we're saying, where suck it up, right?
Yeah.
They both are exhibiting the same tools. They just ended up sitting on different ends of the spectrum. So for us to have a good conversation in terms of role model, I think they both sit in a bandwidth for masculinity,
Yeah, I agree.
not
Yep.
in terms of similarities of character.
Yep.
Right.
So, and both of those things come with athletics. So athletics, we know that when you exercise as a man, that your testosterone levels seem to increase,
right.
right? And the less that you're active, your estrogen levels seem to rise. Now, there's got to be a bigger science to that and a breakdown, but that's the overall scope of it, right? As far as the average person understands.
Right.
Is this just an athletic thing? Is this just being an athlete and being in shape and trying to worry about your diet and things like that? Do you naturally just become a man by doing those things? And the extremes can be taken, right? But I mean, like when it comes to how you get through life and how you build a compound inside of your body to better structure your brain and your mentality, is that coming from testosterone, which seems to be primal, and it's attached to our primal portions of our brain.
Right. So if you look at
I'm making so many smart people mad right now by talking like this. But
right. So if we kind of like break it down into two unique categories, right? So you have the nurture and nature. Okay. So when you look into the nature part of things, what you're mentioning has value, right? You're saying, hey, look, athleticism is consistent exertion of energy. Okay. Because all 7 days, you're either working out, you're doing something that has to enhance your performance. So you're not technically idle per se, right? So there's that active pursuit for energy use. If you don't, which is what you brought up, right? Now, that's where we are more. Like we're the docile types, right? Your average day, you may work out for 20 minutes.
my body shape reflects exactly what you're saying.
Right, so does mine, right? But what I'm saying is now, if you're looking at it from the primal position, it's just we don't exert as much energy. So it's kind of like, and this is a very poor example, breeds of dogs, right? I'm not saying men are dogs. We're just classified as that when we date.
I think we're more dogs than we are women.
Right. The point I'm trying to make here is certain breeds of dog require so much activity to make sure that they stay healthy.
Yeah. Yeah, Jack Russell or something like that.
Right.
You're right. Yeah.
So
Burmese mountain dog. Yeah.
So we can look at now from a nature lens, men where they sit. So that captures that part of it. When it comes to the nurture part of things, this is where like we have to process how we feel. How we present ourselves is secondary, but we still have to process. Hurt is hurt. Loss is loss. Happiness is happiness. Those are biochemical releases that everybody experiences regardless of what your gender is.
Yeah. It's how you react to it. And
Right.
Yeah.
So I feel where the battles are starting to have is like in the nurture, we're trying to be more masculine than there needs to be. Because nurturing is soft. Nurturing is something that you have the affordability to do. You do.
And maybe I'm a caveman, but I feel like women are going to be like, and there's exceptions to every rule, but women are always going to be better nurturers as an overall group than men are going to be.
Yes, but they nurture in a different lens. We nurture in a different lens.
Explain.
So women nurture, and doesn't matter what the gender of the child is, right? And we're talking infancy.
Yeah.
And toddler, okay?
Yeah.
In that, the mothers are more about like, the emotions, the feeding, the sense of safety on a emotional level. Men provide nurturing on the spatial level. So safety from outside.
Providers.
Not necessarily providers, because women also provide. Remember, if you're going into caveman days, there was no economic transaction. There was task. You hunted, you cooked. There were tasks. There was no provider, right?
So we're
corrupting our own thought process minute we go, I earn, that's the disparity. Those are the Bedford wife days, right? The 50s. They classified, you go out and work 9 to 5, because how else do you explain somebody? Because when you stay in the primal lens, prior to the Industrial Revolution, you didn't have this 8 to 8 working in a factory.
No, you're out hoeing the fields.
You were, but see, that's what I'm trying to say. So that's where our physical energies weren't being used to our optimal. Because if you're standing on an assembly line and all you're doing is tightening a rivet and that machine's going.
Yeah,
right.
There.
So now all of a sudden you're gonna have estrogen buildup because you're not designed to stand there tightening rivets. You're decided either to plow the field or go out and hunt or go build a building, go do something, right? So you have to look at those changes as well, where we feel that we are being imprisoned in a sense or we're being diminished in a sense. So those are your later modern age factors. Okay. That's where the problem comes in. But when you say we are providers, we both are providers equally. We just have different roles. So there's no competition there. Because remember, you need two to create one. Yeah. So there is no superiority. They play a key role in terms of the
I agree with you. There's no superiority at all.
Right.
And that's not what I mean by masculinity. No. Even if I go caveman, believe me, I do believe we're equal.
Right. But what I'm saying is when we look at through like the Andrew Tate believers,
who seems to be that they don't think things are equal.
Right. For them, it's kind of like, it's very like, right? Like I have to dominate. And I've heard some of his podcasts and I've just shook my head and I'm like, that's a lot of words.
It's pig-headedness too, right? Like,
so because he's a kickboxer?
He was, not a very good one, but
when you look at it through his eyes, right?
Not better than me.
The best defense is a good offense.
Yeah.
And in those fields, it's how quickly do you get a good hit in? So you look at MMA, you look at kickboxing, you look at any of these high impact sports, boxing, right? It's always how quickly can you get the punch in? How quickly can you get the opponent on his feet, defending the entire time?
Yeah.
Right? That's his MO. That's not a judgment on his character. That's just his MO. That's his style, right? Brady's style is more, I got to read the field.
Well, it is. And
so his is more delayed.
Yeah.
Because he has to see how things unfold. So when it comes to a person that's viewing either experience, he's going to come across as aggressive. He's going to come across as observant. Well, you're always going to fend off aggression, right? Because if you go back to caveman days, you had to, because women were the ones that brought in life. So you had to protect them because they brought in life. You can't take today's knowledge back 1,500 years. You got to go back 1,500 years and leave that and then look and understand it from that lens. Average life was 20 years. Average life was not 80 years, right? And not everybody lived in a cave. You lived out anywhere. We don't know where you live. It's just they said you lived in the cave, not necessarily.
No, we're finding out every day that
that's what I'm
the living
saying.
Conditions were remarkable, right?
And maybe there were a whole bunch of nomadics that would like roam because they couldn't blend in. So then they created their own and da-da-da. So if you're really going to go to history and biology, then you got to go entirely. You can't take today's knowledge and transplant yourself there and then look at the world from there and say that was a better world. It was a very different world because you only live till 20. So your psychology should only live till 20. That's the difference.
You're making me think about, because you're saying like the individuality and the field compared to even a team sport like Tom Brady. When you see men go asexual, this term asexual. So if anybody doesn't know what asexual is, do you have an actual definition of it in your world?
I'd like to hear yours.
So as far as I know, asexual is a man or a woman, somebody that pays attention basically to themselves, and they've removed themselves from the dating world and they focus just on themselves.
Okay.
That's what my understanding of what asexual is, right? Is there a thin line between working in the field by yourself, being in one with nature, and getting your testosterone levels up in your primal form, and I'll explain why I'm asking this question afterwards, and a confusion with asexual belief systems? Because I know that the manliest guy I've ever known in my entire life, I didn't realize how much of a man he was until he wasn't here anymore, which is my father, who owned his own mechanic shop, was a hunter, trapper, fisher, farmer, took care of his land, plowed his fields, took care of cows, the only time he wasn't working is when he was literally just sleeping to get back to work. And it's probably why they left the planet so early, is because he worked himself to death. But the manliest man, and he had more of a relationship with nature than he did any of his brothers or his friends or anything like that. And he was one of the most hardworking, very one-tracked mind, but, you know, sometimes ignorance is bliss. But he was a manly man. So if my father if he wanted to spend that much time by himself, which seemed to work for him, if he had not have that field to plow in, would he become asexual? Is there any connection there?
I think it's a far reach.
I'm trying to understand myself, I think, a bit too. Not that I'm asexual. I've just noticed myself being like, hey, you haven't had a lot of human connection recently. Stop working on yourself. Stop working on work. Go with a woman, which is a very weird way of me telling myself to man up.
Right. I mean, but see, what I'm trying to...
And I'm sorry if I segue completely off of the topic you were trying to make, but I just couldn't stop thinking about it when you kept saying those things, that it relates a bit to my life and my experices. So I wanted to ask that question.
So and this is not unique only to yourself. We need reference points. And this is not a today issue. This is a human species issue that goes across the globe, across cultures, across ages. The reason why I say that is because if let's just go back in time, right? Okay. So let's go back to, we're not going to go to 1480 just for the sake of it, right? Or 300 BC, okay? So like, we'll just stay in the modern life. If you look at post-World War II, right? And you use that as your benchmark, right? What came after World War II for masculine identifiers? You had G.I. Joe, you had the Marlboro Man.
It's funny you're heading in. That's where I was going to take this later on, because I grew up loving He-Man.
Right. Yeah. Superman, Spider-Man, right? You had all these. So Star Wars came, right? So what's happening now is that you have a whole series of icons that you can idolize, because
the Hulk Hogan's, the Macho Man's. I'm telling you, the 80s killed guys like me.
WWE came in.
That's what I mean. It screwed guys like me up.
Well, no, it influenced.
But it did it in the wrong way. Like, you got to remember the beginning of this conversation. I used to do testosterone. I left an acting career and became a professional wrestler running around Canada taking steroids because I was obsessed with Hulk Hogan.
Right. But what I'm saying is...
And He-Man and, Ninja Turtles and all these jacked up monster men.
And that's where...
I wasn't watching She-Ra being like, yeah! You know what I mean? Like, I liked Hordak from She-Ra, which was the bad guy, because he was a bad guy. I didn't relate to any of the women characters. I just wanted these jacked up men, and I wanted to be like that.
So I was 13 when I moved to the U.S., so I grew up in India. And He-Man, when it would come on, like, it was the thing, and like...
It's the best.
And like in school, like, you mimic that, and like Spider-Man came out. I remember Star Wars, and like any stick turned into a
lightsaber. Yeah.
And then you just duked it out, right?
Yeah, Rambo was a big thing for we all had these. We went to Toys R Us and bought these guns. Like they looked like war, they were real war guns, right?
We had cigarette candies.
Cigarette candies, yeah, your Popeye's candy, and the chocolate ones. You can unwrap the chocolate. There used to be chocolate cigarettes too. Yeah.
Well, my parents weren't that rich. Privilege. That's white privilege right there.
The chocolate was horrible, so don't worry, you weren't missing much.
But the point that I'm trying to make is that when you start lacing what masculinity is, you have to understand culture as well. And it's very important that we also reference how we were being brought up. And this is where the nurture part comes in.
Okay.
And it's not about a certain style, right? Because if you look at the 50s and 60s, what was it all about? The man meant to work. He worked from 9 to 5. He came home. The wife was well dressed, had the people ready. You sat down at a dinner table. You didn't speak up. So it was a very hierarchical style of home, right? Right, wrong, that's a conversation that's secondary. The point is that was the funnel system. And now all of a sudden you may have Timmy, who couldn't speak up, even though he wanted to have an opinion, because dad's like, this is the way it is, right? Because that's what culture was expected, right? You went to church on Sundays, whether you wanted to go to church or not. You went to church on Sundays, and Sundays, everybody's entire community went to church.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That didn't mean it was a more moral society. It wasn't a moral
It's
society.
just a structure.
It was just a funnel system. Now,
And also, these were Depression era families too, right? A lot of them had, like, because my grandfather had 9 kids.
right.
Right,
What I'm
so-
saying, but what I'm saying is, as a culture as a whole, it was a post-war culture.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you're 100% right.
Right.
Yeah.
So now you're looking at the baby boomers that are growing up, right? Because silent generation went to war, came back, right? So they have PTSD from the war because nobody has seen the atrocities that they could explain. And
That's why they were having so many kids too. They never know. You didn't know if you're going to lose them, right? Like,
my grandparents' side was like 12 kids.
Yeah.
Because lifespan was different.
it was different.
It was different lifespan. So it made sense. And more people were on the farm than in the factories, right? So what I'm trying to get at is, so you have the silent generation that have these kids. You have these boomers. They have to follow the Stepford wife mindset, right? They're watching I Love Lucy. They're watching I Love Jeannie.
Honeymooners, yeah.
They're watching those kinds of shows
And
that are like,
Gacy, but look at, like, or yeah, what was his name? The guy from the Honeymooners, not Gacy. Ralph Crampton.
yeah.
Oh, Polly right in the kisser. It was almost like masculinity was on a platform here.
Right, because they were trying to justify why. Because now all of a sudden, this man who was farming or doing whatever, went to war, came back, and now was being told, hey, you got to buy a house, got to have a white picket fence, get a car, go work the 9 to 5, raise your family, you go do this on a Saturday, you go do this on a Sunday. So little Timmy, that's the boomer that's growing up, that doesn't agree with it because he's seeing his father's PTSD being taken out somewhere. Right. So where is it going through? It's going through booze,
The wife,
and then it's
the
coming out
screen-
on the
yeah.
kids, right? It's coming because they weren't given the structure on how to have a family. But they're dealing with the massive trauma of PTSD. Okay. Now you jump that. Now little Timmy has grown up, comes into 60s, 70s, Woodstock, experimentation, drugs, but Vietnam War. So now he has inherited a PTSD that he doesn't understand. Plus you have the Cold War of this, one day we're going to get nuked. Canada was just as much a victim as the Americans.
Oh yeah, no, they taught it.
Right,
They
so
taught
if you-
everybody, even up to like a portion of my generation in the '80s, like when we were young. It went away by the '90s. They were still somewhat prepping us for that.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is where your nature nurture needs to be looked at from a cultural lens and a social lens, because that affects how we are and how we see the world. So when you're looking at masculinity and you're saying, okay, let me be a caveman and let me be a provider and let me provide safety. Well, you're 40, 50 years of this trauma corruption. So your sense of safety is what? Self-preservation or provider? Because the skill didn't get transferred. Because if you go back to the caveman days, they didn't have external threats. They had imminent threats, which they had a way to quantifiably protect. Because collectively, somebody either had to watch on the treetop, right?
Yeah.
Or they collectively went and hunted. But once they were done, they didn't go out and hunt overly excessively.
They just got what they needed.
They got what they needed.
It's a lion mentality, right? A lion only hunts when it's hungry. It doesn't
Right.
just hunt for killing.
So if you
It's not like
go
a tiger.
so when you look at those kinds of small villages, right, the community mindset was different. So now as a nurturer, that hunter is not hunting 7 days a week, is he? Or 5 days a week from 9 to 5. He's not. He's gone for 3 or 4 days, but they bring enough back that there's enough to last. And then once
Couple
they're
weeks, yeah.
so now but we're not talking about that. We're only talking about spirits of the flesh and then the head on the wall. That's not what we're talking about.
So almost our approach on the caveman mentality is wrong. Like that term caveman mentality.
It's insufficient.
I've always liked the term one-dimensional a little bit better. One-dimensional thinking.
Insufficient.
Insufficient is probably a really good word
Because
for
that is the true thing. It's insufficient. If you expand it and genuinely account for how it was then and look at it through that lens, don't look at it through a 2026 lens. We're always looking away to ping. We're designed to ping. Okay, our brain is designed to look and reference and understand for ourselves because we're trying to identify ourselves. So to understand our internal world, where do we look? We look into our external world. When we look into our external world, where's the first 2 places we look? When we were toddlers, we looked to who we knew. We go to faces we recognize, right? And then you build from that. So the more consistent that world is, then you get into the outer world, which is the world you interact with. And then depending on how stable that is, then you build out. But that pattern stays for the rest of our lives because our environment always changes. So the more safe we feel in these two spheres, the better we are when we interact with others. So it's not a masculine or a lack of masculinity.
I think
when it becomes individual, because that's where nature and nurture play a role. So I'll give you a very good example. I was looking at Andrew Tate, right? And I was like trying to understand him. Not why he speaks the way he speaks.
Yeah, it's not about the sentences that he's saying. It's about
his
how
stance,
the mentality
right.
and the placement he's in.
So I'll give you a very good walkthrough of nature, nurture, and Andrew Tate. Okay, so Andrew Tate was born in 1986. Okay, he was born to biracial. So he's a biracial, right? His dad is African American and his mother is British. Okay, now the father was a chess player, but he was in the Air Force. Okay, the mother worked at a diner and did catering and stuff like that. But she came from like if you're looking at the 80s, chances are came from the war to America for a better life, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Andrew Tate's paternal granddad actually fought in World War II.
Okay.
So now it's the pure African-American descent. So now you have to understand African-American history coming through to understand his father and how he saw the world. Because he lived in a white American world. Because even though they had civil rights and they had the Emancipation Proclamation done in 1866, they didn't get civil rights for another 100 years.
Yeah, it took a long time.
So imagine how many generations have grown up with that subservient. So obviously they're going to have a very kind of thing, but they worked in fields and stuff, right? Now he is 2 years old. They moved to Chicago. He is 6 years old. They moved to Indiana. Now these are rural towns in the late 80s. He's a biracial kid. Society and environments aren't very nurturing to him to begin with.
Yeah, he probably had a weird growing up.
Then when he turned 11, the parents divorced. Mom moved to England. They lived in government housing on government assistance.
Him and his brother.
They also have a sister, Janine, a younger sister. Yeah.
I've never even heard about the sister before. I haven't paid. It's not like I know this guy's life, but realistically, I've never heard that there was even a
sister,
sister or a mother. I thought it was just the boys and the dad. But...
Right. And that's what I'm trying to say, right? So when you're looking at it from his lens, and you start adding all these layers. And then when he was 19, he got into kickboxing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you look at it through a nature lens, and you look at through human biology lens, right? And you look at childhood, you look at adolescence, and then you look at young adults. So childhood goes up till about 11, okay? I'm approximating here.
Yeah.
And then adolescence is about 11, 12, and it goes to about 20, okay? It's plus minus, right? And then
unless you're me and it goes to 30, but...
or its maintenance continues.
Yeah, it's still going.
Yeah, I haven't passed childhood yet. Imagine that. The point I'm trying to make is when you look at him now, you see how those absences. He was growing up with a single mother at 11.
I think I'm starting to understand how.
Not only now, if the mother had not left the U.S., he would still have a sense of security and safety. They moved to England, and they moved to Luton. And if you want to have an understanding of where Luton, England.
Okay. We'll use Luton just because it sounds fun.
Yeah.
Okay. But Luton, yeah.
So Luton is about where Ajax is from us.
Oh, okay. So it's not. We're in the vicinity, but it's still it's
go back to before the 401 was built.
Oh, that's a whole day away.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or the connectivity is not as continuous. And living in government housing in a foreign country as a biracial kid and American. And you're getting into your teen years.
So by the time he hits kickboxing,
it's exact pure aggression release. That's why his approach, his best defense is a good offense, because he'd rather get you on your heels and on your back. And you look at any of his podcasts, and I've watched it, his MO is,
I'm sorry to hear that.
I'm going to go with the first hit. And I'm going to keep giving you hits. That's why he bounces. Anytime you corner him, you notice he'll pivot. He'll say something even more egregious.
No, he goes off the deep end. Like,
So to me, when you come out talk about masculinity, right? Now we flip the coin and look at.
I was going to say, so Tom Brady, explain how Tom Brady becomes the way that he is from what you know.
He doesn't have that many disruptions.
It wouldn't seem like he would because he's kind of silver spoon.
Not necessarily. It's disruptions. You're looking at disruptions. You're not looking at provisions, right? Because the brain was going to register the disruption. Like, you gave a very good example about, 12 with Gone Girl, right? That's a disruption. At 16, we were talking about with your dad. That's a disruption, right? Disruptions and provisions are two different things because the brain registers them differently. The brain will earmark a disruption. Why? Because it's jarring. Remember when you were young and you stick your hand in the socket and you got?
I kept doing it.
Right.
I even had a Darkwing Duck action figure that had a plug on the top of his head, and I would like constantly stick that thing in the outlet. I was a nutbag.
But at some point,
I just like the smells.
But at some point, that disruption registered, right? Falling off your bike, right? When you were wrestling, right?
No, the wrestling was brutal.
But you registered. So we register disruptions. Why? Because they're discomforting. So then we learn how to avoid it. When we were learning how to ride a bike, right? So if we go back to Andrew Tate, let's assume, like when he was wanting to learn to ride a bike, right? Maybe his dad wasn't as present or his mom wasn't as present. So he had to figure out himself. Another interesting fact, when you bring in nurture versus nature, it's when you look at birth order, he was the eldest. So now he's
stepping into that role as the man.
But he's being forced into that role because now they've moved to England.
So he's the man of the house.
But he doesn't have access to his dad the way he would have if he was living in the U.S. So if, say, they had gotten divorced and dad was living on the other side of town, well, dad was accessible. This is late 90s, across the pond.
Yeah, he's got
and
no
there's
father
no direct
figure.
flights from London. You got to come to Heathrow or Gatwick. And if you're on government housing and government subsidy assistance, you're not coming to go visit your dad. So your entire teen years, you don't have a role model.
As far as we know, and we're assuming that his mom didn't have a really responsible stepdad or a boyfriend. But yes, I know what you mean.
What I'm trying to say is that when
there's no anchor.
This is where the Jordan Peterson question comes in as well, is that you have to also expand. That's why it's insufficient. Because they're giving you these templates that you're measuring against because you're trying to find relevance. But they're not saying, hey, also account for these anomalies. Because if you started accounting for the anomalies, you'll start recognizing, I'm like Forrest Gump. Genuinely, we are more Forrest Gumps.
I was going to say more than you even know, Sim.
Right. We are more Forrest Gumps than not. Didn't Forrest Gump wish that he would be with Jenny when she was going off to San Francisco and he had to go and fight the war?
For one, it's a fictional character on a very overrated movie, but I understand what you're saying.
You break my heart.
It's very overrated.
I love that movie.
I don't hate it as much as some of the critics out there do, but I like Lieutenant Dan.
Yeah.
I think he makes the movie for me, but yeah, I know what you're saying. We're all Forrest Gump. We're all kind of just
we are all Forrest Gumps.
Yeah.
And it's okay because that's a good starting point. And now you could kind of go, okay, how much of sternness do I need to bring? How much of softness do I need to bring? And how do I match that? Because I didn't get it when I was younger, right? My dad's a very good example of that because my grandfather was a very strict stoic, like by the, you had to fit in the squares. But his father was like that. My dad tried to be like that. I try not to be that.
Why?
Because I didn't like how it felt. So I remember how it felt when I was that age, rather than trying to be.
That your dad was trying to fit into his father's role and apply that.
Not his role. We only teach what we know. So if you learn more, you can teach more.
But why did it make you feel uncomfortable? Was it the same because
it's a feeling, right? Everybody likes, doesn't matter what your age is. There is no societal rule that when you're 13, you can't go and cuddle with your parents. There is no hard and fast rule.
I think that creates a whole borderline group of problems.
I'm not talking about like cuddling as we did as children. That's not what I'm saying. But comfortable enough that you can give them a hug. That's
okay, that's different.
That's cuddle, right?
I've seen some touchy-feely families though, right? And that's always made me uncomfortable. Is that part of my masculinity?
That's the issue, because now what are you doing? You're automatically trying to reference yourself. And that's what I'm trying to get at, is that we constantly are referencing ourselves. Referencing.
Okay.
Comparing is something's wrong with me. Referencing is, okay, that position's there, this position's here. What's the distance? It's a reframe of the mind. So if you're saying I am comparing myself to others, right? Same thing. I'm referencing myself to what they have. And this is how it makes me feel. You're doing the exact same thing, but you're processing it in a different way. Now you're processing it without something that's missing in you, even though there is something missing. We did it as kids too. What I'm trying to get at here is that that is a normal thing to do, and we continue to do it. We don't need to then start jumping 2,000 years back and saying that is true masculinity. Because there is no true masculinity, because it's all imagery.
So if I could take something from my past, right? And I've mentioned it a few times now. I was a child actor. I'd go to auditions, but I'd always have my mom with me. My early years, right? She was my manager / the person to keep an eye on me. So my mom and I would go to these auditions, and you'd be in the waiting room some days for an hour or two, and you see lots of different kids and their moms come in and out, right? In the same relationship that I had. But I remember even as a young man, and my mom, who was a very emotional, nurturing lady, still is to this day, thought it was weird too, that we would see some kids being overly affectionate with their mothers, and it just felt weird.
Right. So
but I felt like that was like, I looked at them at that age, and I still, to this day, 30-something years later, as those boys were a little light in their loafers. Like there's something, I mean, I loved my mom, and she was my best friend at that age, but the last thing you'd see me do in front of a group of people with 13-year-old boys or 12-year-old boys in the room is laying in my mom's bosom. Right. Waiting to go into an audition.
Right. So that is a different conversation. That is, how do you process emotions? Yeah. How do you create boundaries?
I think this comes into the same thing, though, because that's where my man up thing, if I felt, right?
Right. No. What I'm trying to get at is that it deserves a separate conversation, because now we are passing an observation without facts on understanding how emotions get expressed, right?
Okay.
To the necessities of boundaries, the necessities of separation and independence. That's got nothing to do with manning up. That's just got to do with parenting. That's got to do with, eventually the child has to learn to become independent. It's got nothing to do with the child's gender. It's got to do with the way as human beings on a biological lens. If you go back 3,000 years, it was, we fed you, we nurtured you, you started walking, we made sure you didn't hit things, right? Once you got to a certain age, because remember, life expectancy was like 25, 30. Mm-hmm. So if you exhibited strength, you went into the ones that went out and hunted. If you exhibited something else, you were the one that went and did the farming. You see what I'm saying? So by 10, 11, the elders kind of knew which direction your body was going to go into.
Yeah, they kind of point in that direction.
And then you started weaning them out. So the one that had to go out into the forest for days, well, he had to be weaned off being in connection with the community a lot sooner than the one that went to farm. That's what I'm saying. It's a different conversation, because that's separations of energy. So when you as an observer look at that, because of your nurture nature environment, and which is norm, the questions that you raise have validity, because what you're saying is that's abnormal.
It just seemed weird.
It is
it didn't seem manly, and it
abnormal.
didn't seem, it seemed odd, and still to this day later on I still look back at that and I'm like, that was kind of weird. And I can only imagine what those young gentlemen and moms are up to nowadays. I just can't see a result that ends very positive if you're that attached. So that you genuinely see issues with. That is a dysfunction. That's not a passment of judgment. I'm not trying to judge anybody. No. I'm talking from my clinical lens, right? That's a genuine concern.
that deserves a conversation and addressing. That's what
I think those things lead to losing masculinity.
Not necessarily losing masculinity, it loses emotional regulation, because now that individual, right, has an inability to regulate emotions independently.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, whether you're male or female, you have to process emotions independently. That's what that interferes with.
And I agree with that. Independent emotion and independent working on yourself. This is where I said I'm constantly telling myself to either not, and for lack of better words, not be a pussy, right? Man up. And I don't mean pussy as in a woman's vagina. I mean, like, don't be a little kitty cat, scaredy cat.
Right.
Right. And that's where that term came from, scaredy cat.
Right.
Do not be, you know, a wimp. Right. Sometimes there's uncomfortable situations that I'm going to have to take on head on in life. And maybe for a lack of better term, I call that manning up.
Right, but
women are in that situation too. Right. And they can man up, and I understand that. And I'm trying to play a bit of a. I'm trying to put myself in a bit of a category so that we can get this conversation. Because if we both realize that we agree on the same thing right from the very beginning, this isn't going to be a very long conversation.
Right. What I'm trying to tell you is this: is that I agree with you. So to kind of shape that a little bit,
I'm going to have more smelling salts because I feel like my estrogen levels are
right.
Sim.
And we have the Hulk. Yeah. Yeah. So let's look at it from a manosphere of hierarchy. Okay. So
I'm ready. Okay. I'm in the manosphere right now.
So you have alpha, you have omega, you have the betas, and you have sigmas, right? So alphas are like your Andrew Tates and your Tom Brady's. Okay. Your omegas are kind of like, for a good reference, would be like any of the linebackers, right? Like anybody that's a supporting cast that sits there. They tend to agree with the alphas. They stay close to the pack, and they do kind of like follow the leader kind of thing.
Yeah.
Your omegas, they tend to be like the outsiders, the outliers. They struggle to belong. They're the ones that are picked on, like the nerds in school, right? They're the dorks, right? And then you have the sigmas that don't care. They have their own path. They do their own thing. So if you look at that and you look at it through like a pop culture lens, right? A classic a classic alpha that is revered by all is James Bond. He is the ultimate, like if a guy could be the ultimate man, he'd want to be James Bond. All the fictional characters out there.
Or John Rambo. I like John Rambo.
Right.
Because John Rambo was in touch with his emotions at the end of the...
So was
not the Rambo 1 or 3, but just First Blood. If we're using First Blood character, Rambo was a manly man.
Yeah, but
he's a nutbag.
Right.
But he was a manly man.
But I'd live to die another day.
Well, you beat me there.
Yeah.
It's a lot better of a title than First Blood Part 2.
Exactly. Exactly. And then you get into Brian O'Connor from Fast and Furious. That's a classic omega. Right? Because you had your alpha, right? Then you look at your beta, right? And the best beta that I can think of is Jim from American Pie.
Okay.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Awkward dork, wants to ask the girl out. And that's a lot of us. That's a lot of us, whether it's at 12, whether it's at 25, whether it's at 42. Whether it's a 47 being a Tom Brady, right? He's trying to get back in the dating scene.
Which is absurd to me, because if I even had half of his looks, I'd be
but yet you see, married
tomorrow.
She's already happily married with the jiu-jitsu instructor, and can't even keep Kim Kardashian. Like seriously?
No, I don't.
Right? And it's not a judgment thing, right? And then you look at your Sigma, John Wick. Right?
Okay.
So now as an individual, I have to figure out where I belong or who I'm more aligned with, because those are what we learn from. Those are what we emulate. Like you and I were doing He-Man, or whether we were doing Luke Skywalker, right? We were always picking the hero.
Yeah, as a kid, as an adult, I started picking people like Norm Macdonald and things like that, who seem to be more, the guy who plays the dumb guy in the room, but yet is the smartest and keeps the most information, but is very in tune with his
Right. So you're taking an omega kind of role.
Yeah.
So you see how you're finding yourself in the hierarchy. The best way to not overwhelm your mind is to understand that you are all four, depending on the situation. And as long as you can understand how to be fluid, because there are situations when you are an alpha, there are situations where you're an omega, there's situations when you're a beta, there's situations when you're a sigma. And I'll give you a very good example of how you can be all four simultaneously. Okay. Say you're going on a date and you want to be chivalrous and you're taking action. That's alpha, right? You're doing things. You're buying flowers. You're planning that. That's alpha.
Yeah.
Okay. An omega would be co-parenting, making sure that, things are getting done, the house is run, right? You're co-collaborating. That's being an omega, right? Because you're now equal, right? Certain areas, like if females are nurturers, what role did you take? She became an omega, right? She's not competing because she's the alpha in that arena. You're like, okay, let me go. What else I can do? Right?
Yeah.
Right. A beta is your 9 to 5.
Okay.
You're not anybody that works, whether you're an entrepreneur or you're an employee, you're a beta. Why? Because somebody else is dictating what you cannot do. You may present yourself in any way you want. You're a genuine beta.
So this is why I was an entrepreneur, not by choice most of my life, not realizing it, because I was living in an alpha state.
You were living in a sigma state.
Wouldn't that be considered alpha from what you just laid out, though?
No, alpha is more like taking charge, right? Alphas tend to be the ones that lead, that make the decisions.
Yeah.
Right? Omegas are the ones that kind of like follow what's there. They kind of like stay within,
Yep.
right? And then your betas are like the outliers, and then sigmas are like completely, right? That's why I kind of like gave the James
I guess
Bond.
it was kind of a hybrid, I think, of the alpha sigma thing.
Right,
But
that's
yeah,
what I'm saying.
yeah.
You're all
Yeah.
four,
Yeah.
right? You may have different percentages.
Oh, I'm starting to understand with this conversation about, you're right about the four categories of man, but we're all...
You are all four. And as long as you can understand that you are a square, you may have certain affinities to certain parts. So you may have certain percentages that are higher, but you're not going to be greater than 100. And you're never going to be equal 25s.
Sim, how are you not so busy that you couldn't even take this meeting today? Because you're a brilliant human being. I have learned so much just about, not from the very beginning I was learning. Every time you talk, I learn. But holy crap, I think I just had an epiphany while you were saying this. And hopefully anybody else watching had that same epiphany. A man needs to be in tune with every portion of what a man is.
Yeah.
And in those four categories, you have laid out what four different types of men are, but have made a very good case of saying how we're all this.
Yeah.
This is us.
Yeah.
Figure out what makes sense for you and your life and the scenarios you've been through those four categories, and apply what works and what doesn't.
Yeah.
We have a natural instinct to know what works for us.
Yeah.
Some people love to go against the grain and their own worst enemy.
Right.
But if we can come in tune with those four things as a man and try and figure out what works, what doesn't, cut out some of that stuff, focus on some of the things that seem to apply to our lives the best.
Yeah.
I think because like I've always been in the impression of just like, man up.
No, and that's why it creates this tension. So, because I work with a lot of men, right? And a lot of times we're working with like self-identity.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's a non-scientific rubric that I created. And basically we do that, right? We go, okay, this is the four, right? And then the categories within it that I use is identity, action, regulation, awareness, connection, drive, and independence. Okay, so each one, they're self-explanatory, right?
Yeah,
so like say for regulation, right? Because that is the soft spot. Because we've been kind of like talking about, manning up or suck it up, buttercup, or, boys don't cry, whatever you want to go under.
Yeah.
Regulation is the hardest. Where? Because internally we feel what we need to feel, and we're not any different. You could be an alpha, you could be a sigma, you could be an omega, you could be a beta, you could be any gender, right? You're still going to feel. It's how we can express comfortably. That's where regulation comes. Regulation doesn't come internally. Regulation comes externally. So once you realize, say one is I cannot express myself. Okay. And 10 is I can comfortably express myself. Okay. And now you put Andrew Tate. Well, guess where Andrew Tate's going to be? He's going to be in the 1-2 area. Genuinely, he's going to be in the 1-2 area. Why? Because he has to have that strong sense of being. Why? Because now we go back and you look at it and you look at his teen years where he grew up in a social housing on government assistance as a biracial kid in England in the late 90s. And then he took kickboxing. That's a direct reference on why he has difficulty regulating emotions and he's going to sit on the spectrum. So I, as a therapist, through this rubric, have a better understanding of where the individual is. So it's no longer about masculinity. It's no longer about being a caveman. It's no longer about being function. It's about, okay, where do you sit in this? Where you sit in that square? And how do you then find your own meaning and then pull from influences that help you and away from influences that interfere? And you're okay then, because we're all Forrest Gumps and we're all wanting our own Jennies.
Sim, I love not only working for this company because I get to have conversations like this, but I love the fact that we get to film it and put it out there.
Absolutely. And I appreciate being called, like being part of this. Like it's just phenomenal because I love these conversations.
Well, let's put a bullet point there. We'll continue this conversation in a part 2. We've gotten the red light about 5 minutes ago, 10 minutes ago now. They've been screaming at us to get out of here. I think we're making too much sense, right? That must be what it is.
Yeah.
But ladies and gentlemen, that has been the conversation with my buddy Sim about being a man. Look I learned something, and I hope you did too. Please visit tplmedia.ca for more information and more shows like this. And yeah, download the app True Patriot Love on the App Store for Android and the App Store for Apple. That's it. I'm Brady Whetham. Stay safe.